So my name's Adam Murray, and yeah, essentially I've been a film programmer curator for the last 8 years, almost a decade, and most of that activity has taken place in and around Bristol, um, with a number of different film collectives. So, but mainly with a film collective called Comes Revolution, which is it's based in the city of Bristol, and has been, we've sought funding through sort of BFI Film Hub, and the main kind of purpose for that was to. It was basically at the time. It was just a really lucky moment at the time. Six or seven of us just arrived, descended on Bristol at a particular time from various different backgrounds, some academic, some sort of working in the industry. And it was really about creating a collective of programmers and filmmakers, and sort of like local community figures who could reintroduce the history of Black cinema to the city, and try and sort of engage with different communities, but specifically the Black community, but different communities within the city around, like, hey, let's celebrate Black cinema, diasporically as well. So it could be African continent, it could be European, British Black film, African American film, but really its essential focus was to sort of proliferate a joy of cinema, and to sort of say, hey, look at this rich history of Black film. And I think at its sort of highest point, we were able to be part of it, this sort of fantastic celebration of Black film through the BFI. It was a British Film Institute strand called Black Star, and within that, we were able to kind of focus on certain films. We screened Prince's Purple Rain at what used to be known as Colston Hall. So, of course, in the city, there's a lot of history around what's taken place with Black Lives Matter marches, the statue, the changing of the name of Colston Hall, and the kind of history and legacy of Colston. And I always feel as if we were a very small moment, because there are many people in the city that have done incredible work around this topic. It didn't just spring up out of nowhere on the news one summer's afternoon in a pandemic. This is something that a lot of community members and speakers have fought for over years, of sort of the discriminatory impact of Colston's legacy and his relationship to the slave trade. So, I mean, it feels like I'm going off on a tangent, but this all goes sort of full cycle, because all of this stuff is related, and I think the Prince moment was a kind of quiet before the storm, which was a nod to the fact that somehow the venue had to change its name, but it was also a way of bringing lots of people under one roof to sort of celebrate this sort of Black pop icon. So yeah, that was a real highlight of that moment. I mean, we're still kind of going. We've kind of shelved things because of the pandemic, but I think there's activity around with that collective coming up soon. But my initial kind of leap into being a curator and programmer was with these guys, and has been a fantastic 8 years working with some incredible people that are involved in that collective, and out of that. Started to become a kind of like a real urge to start looking at the genre that had influenced me or influenced my interest in the moving image. And for me, that's horror cinema. The horror thing for me goes way back to being a kid. Before we moved to the Southwest, my folks initially are from London, then moved out to East Anglia. So we lived like on the Broads and Lowestoft, and I got the book here, man. It's like Ghosts of the Broads. So I mean, it's like, man, I was just obsessed with this, and it's actually, I can't show you the girl's name, But obviously, as a kid at school, and this was published in Norwich as well, at 76, so the year before I was born. But this book I was obsessed with, and obviously, sort of growing up around the Broads. And that's so sweet because it's quite clear that it also sort of shows how much of a geek I was. That little girl sort of writing all over my book to say, Adam, stop reading that and talk to me. But I was so sort of obsessed with this stuff from sort of childhood onwards. I think for me, it's very much about sort of ghosts, UFOs, and nuclear bombs. I think it comes out of that being an 80s kid, and all of those different sort of fears that revolved around that kind of Cold War era vibe. And I think those three sort of motifs from childhood have sort of influenced my interests over the years, particularly around cinema. So I mean, like my sort of focus of research or things that I'm really interested in are kind of like utopian, dystopian cinema. Love a kind of like apocalyptic cinema. Kind of cosmic horror, Lovecraftian horror. And one of the reasons I'm kind of keen on that is because we know sort of now how much of a xenophobe Lovecraft actually was, particularly around sort of notions of blackness and Orientalism. So we were kind of talking about that earlier before we started the interview. And for me, it's kind of like his work is that there are rich opportunities to kind of reinterpret Lovecraft's work and reimagine kind of cosmic horror. There's a great Indigenous American film director that I love by the name of Jeff Barnaby, and his recent zombie film, highly recommend. Really, just something else, superb. And also a film called Rhymes for Young Ghouls, which I highly recommend. And I think he's exploring like an indigenous interpretation of cosmic horror. So kind of taking H.P. Lovecraft, but then looking at his own cultural stories and motifs and just flipping it on its head. So I think that there are all of these different opportunities to explore and reimagine horror cinema. And then, I like haunted house movies, science fiction, horror. There are all of these different kind of approaches. And of course, zombies, for obvious reasons, but we can get into that in a bit. But all of these things these things collided over time, like massive Stephen King fan, and of course just horror movies from a kid all the way through to an adult.
So what specific film titles, horror film titles, caught your imagination and to some extent still do today?
So interestingly, so Bristol Black Horror Club is going to launch at a Bristol-based film festival called Cinema Rediscovered, and they're fantastic guys, and I just want to say a very big thank you to Mark and Maddie. They know who they are, kind of vibe, but they're just such an incredible team, and all of the people that are involved with Cinema Rediscovered, it really is just something else. And to be offered this opportunity to kind of launch Horror Club at this very prestigious festival at like the venue of my dreams, a place called 20th Century Flicks on Christmas Steps in Bristol. Yeah, it's like, it's like a geek's dream come true, right? So that's happening not this weekend, but the weekend after, which Friday the 30th of July, and that's going to be a screening of The Beast Must Die. So back to that thing of what those early films. I mean, this is just like a dream come true for me. It's really, it's quite sort of bizarre how it's all sort of fallen into place. But The Beast Must Die is a film that I watched very young, BBC Two. I think BBC Two, if not BBC Two, Channel 4, one of those sort of classic late night screenings where you trick your parents into thinking you're asleep, but you sneak down the stairs, and watch a horrible spooky film. And for me, just to see like number one, Peter Cushing, who by that stage I was already a huge fan of, and obviously, how many associatives spring to mind when we talk about Peter Cushing, right? Doctor Who. I mean, that's an hour, 2 hour podcast in its own right. But for me to see Calvin Lockhart on screen with Peter Cushing and the rapport between the Doctor and the Hunter, and the trappings of race in the 1980s, which for me, all I can think of is like, dog poo through the letterbox, being called names on the playground, having to fight for your rights at all times, bullying from teachers, all of this kind of stuff, skinheads, and Weetabix adverts, where the adverts for kids are flipping skinheads in red braces and DMs. I mean, like, fear was around every corner.
Just one titchy bit of toast, we gotta put them straight. We're the Weetabix.
Yeah!
We don't like breakfast fit for sparrows. Nothing to them, mate. We're the Weetabix.
What we got in here then?
Clear that stuff away. You make it neat, wheat, mate. If you know what's good for you, you do.
Okay.
The Weetabix. If you know what's good for you.
Okay.
Even in the stuff that was kind of punted to us to be interested in, there were very literal threats, and also kind of threats, latent threats that are just kind of like programmed into you through childhood. So for me to see this really strong, handsome black brother on screen with the very sophisticated and eloquent Peter Cushing, looking dapper as usual and fine garments, and just these two professional men having this rapport, and race not being being this very positive thing. And also, I think, just the way in which Peter Cushing, which I've been able to do recently in researching the film before this festival, but the way in which Peter Cushing reacts to Calvin Lockhart, and the kind of rapport that they have as actors on screen is just something else. And of course, the fantastic Marlene Clark is in the movie of Gandron Hess fame.
Yeah, know it well.
And then I would say very quickly, the other thing that absolutely destroyed me as a kid, but I love, and again, the irony of this motif, Keith David is one of my heroes, man. Like, I just can't think of anyone more immense that's out there as a performer. I remember my dad sometimes, what he would do is, I would get so excited about certain films, he'd stay up late, he'd record them, but he'd try and cut out anything that was too hardcore. But the Huskies moment, where that we get the kind of Lovecraftian, Cthulhu-esque splitting of the head and the tentacles, tentacle beasts from another dimension vibe. And that was it. That just sent me into kind of like, oh my God, what am I watching? Just completely messed me up. And I joke with my dad about this all the time. I'm like, actually, in that moment, and then if we think about like Video Nasties and the stuff that the kind of the motifs around sensibilities that we grew up with during that time, I'm really glad that my dad was quite radical in doing that. And I'm like, I thank you for doing that. And then, ironically, the two final characters are Kurt Russell and Keith David. And again, that these are moments where I think we end up having allies, horror allies, or allies in Hollywood that were able to kind of open up the doors enough. I think things are about to change dramatically, and I'm excited for that. And it's about time. But I think in those early moments, I think it's no wonder that these films had a massive impact on me, and specifically for these reasons, because representationally, all it takes is for little boys and little girls are fascinated by space stories and aliens and monsters and ghosts and mythological tales. And if we can't see ourselves on screen, then so yeah, I think these things, these moments are the motifs that open the doors. And I think John Carpenter is kind of an ally, and then, the running motif to They Live again, with Keith David. But I think there are moments where certain white directors have definitely tried to kind of say, right, I'm doing this. I'm going to try and flip the script, so to speak.
What's interesting is you've mentioned pretty much films that have been game changers, like Beast Must Die, and obviously John Carpenter's The Thing, and so forth. It still wasn't enough, was it? Because representation of Black characters in horror, certainly in the past, and to some extent today, has been, shall we say, questionable. When did you first realize there was that disparity in the representation?
It's always there, because it's there in life. Mm-hmm. So, the older we get and the more media we consume, it becomes glaringly obvious the older we get. And I, like my journey initially, I wanted to act, and that's a story for another time. But I certainly faced moments where I was definitely bullied and blocked from a certain trajectory. And I think that's where what cemented for me this moment of maybe I want to be behind the camera and not in front of the camera. And this leads me to a perfect kind of revelatory moment. And it's something that crops up in a lot of research, particularly around horror. This is a great book, of which the documentary is based on. We'll probably get into that a bit later, but Professor Robin Armeens Coleman, Horror Noir, which is superb, second to none, and the truly incredible Tananarive Due and her UCLA course, The Sunken Place, named after Jordan Peele's fictitious MK Ultra systemic racism inducing nightmare world. I don't know really how else to explain that. It's quite a difficult one to articulate, but
I think you summed it up.
I think Professor Coleman makes a very important distinction, which is one which is around real horrors, and a kind of fantastical horrors, and then also kind of like a means of production thing, which is kind of just what we were talking about a second ago, which is kind of moments where representationally certainly Romero kickstarting, as you'd said, with Dwayne Jones in Night of the Living Dead, which I'm obsessed with. I'm obsessed with Romero, and I'm obsessed with those leading men. Romero's films, just obsessed with, and I think I will forever be obsessed with his films and him. I think as a creative force. Rest in peace. But yeah, all of this stuff is tied together back to Professor Coleman. I think, because I think she's kind of sums up really well. It's all of these different sort of intersections of, real lived historicity of horror, which we've seen with George Floyd, and has been highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement. Then there's a historicity in Hollywood, representationally of horror. For me, Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith, for me that's a horror film for me. And I remember being in eventually I kind of went back as sort of like a mature student, studied film. I remember standing up in a lecture and saying, do you remember that era of time where it was like on AFI and BFI lists, it's like, it's a very racist film, but it's still in the top 5 best films ever. And it's like, what are you on about, man? Technically, Birth of a Nation is it's an incredible technical innovation historically in cinema, but it isn't anything more than that. It's a horrific piece of hateful propaganda. And I'm outspoken about it. For me, that's a horror film. It's literally a horror film. And then on the other hand, there's kind of and again, back to representation. So I think it's so much of this is about exploring representation, but there's also something else, which is when it comes to means of production, I think Tanana Review, Professor Coleman, and the fantastic horror noir documentary as well kind of goes into this, but it's this kind of notion of there is representationally a history of blackness in horror on screen from the 20s onwards. King Kong, some of the early race movies, Son of Ngagi, and Oscar Micheaux. A lot of these guys were exploring all of these themes around miscegenation, and of course, those filmmakers made retorts to Griffith's film. I think At the Gates is worth looking into. So there's a distinction. There's representationally, Black people have been in Black horror from the beginning of the moving image. And then secondarily, there's a moment of what then distinguishes a Black horror or a horror noir. And I think that's led by who is behind the camera, means of production. So the set, script writer, director, and then of course representation who's in front of the camera. So I think what I would put into a Black horror category would be a film that is made primarily by Black folks, in the sense that the script, a good example of that, Rusty Cundiff's Tales from the Hood, which goes back and plays with the kind of anthology roots of horror, because both Rusty and the producer Darren Scott, massive old school horror fans, Amicus and Hammer horror fans, these guys. And then I think it's about allies, as we've said. But I think the most important point is that it's not just shallow representation, because if we think about the 1980s, that's a moment where we start to see more Black faces in horror movies. I mean, you've even got Yaphet Kotto turns up in a Freddy movie, and Lawrence Fishburne in Dream Warriors, but certainly my favorite Elm Street movie. But then what happens in some of these 80s movies is that we fall into sort of stereotypical tropes, the sacrificial Negro, the kind of mystical Negro. So these characters become, or these characters are there to prop up the white heroes. So I think representation is good, but it kind of has to be a bit more. There's got to be a bit more at stake, and that's what I think. I think that's why I've always liked sort of John Carpenter, and I think People Under the Stairs is a very good example of a white director putting both feet in and saying, I'll stand with you. I want to make this film that challenges what's taking place in America in this particular moment, but I'm not going to cop out on you. I'm going to match you. This isn't just going to be a token gesture of representation. I'm really going to try and hold firm with the talent that's on screen. So I think there's a lot there to unpack,
It's interesting you mention People Under the Stairs, just following up, because that was Wes Craven, again, putting a person of color, if you like, front and center in a very important role, like he did with Dream Warriors.
Again, it's another generic trope in horror cinema, which is, the Black character dies in the first act. So, and very much, if we think about, Carol Clover or any of the explorations of horror from a feminist perspective, same thing, Women in Chainsaws, it's the final girl. So I think, horror can be this kind of conduit for sort of catharsis, critical reimagining, and I think it can also very much reveal to us what was taking place in society. If we're looking at horror historically, you know, I think it's it's very revealing about where we were at as a species at any given time, and whether that's King Kong or, you know, I Know What You Did Last Summer.
So it's a difference between, as you say, tokenism, putting someone there and saying, look, we have a black person in the film, to actually giving them some substantial role in the film, really, isn't it? That's why would you say that's why that kind of representation is important, especially in horror?
Yeah, I think thankfully and slowly we're moving into a new era. And I mean, certainly part of my drive around Horror Club isn't just to kind of screen horror film. I mean, I'm hoping at some point, as things sort of evolve, it also could potentially become a platform for new talent. Certainly for Bristol filmmakers and young people, and hopefully regionally. The reason I called it as a club is because I wanted it to start small, and for it to be kind of like a city-based thing and regional-based thing. But I would love to be, if it does take legs. I mean, who knows? We don't know with COVID and all of the crazy things that are going on. But the hope is that it can grow into something that is sort of multi-platformed. I mean, to begin with, where we're at, it's hopefully a website, a podcast. But I think part of my drive around horror and exploring blackness and horror, and then with a kind of shift of focus into exploring race and gender in horror, is that it works on multiple levels. You know, for me, I'm thinking like diasporically, so people of African heritage, like myself as a mixed race man. I'm a light-skinned mixed race man, but at the same time, I want it to be inclusive, to explore the manifold different experiences of blackness. I mean, my whole thing is like, I think of like, certainly think of my granddad who passed away last year, and he's a Swahili speaker. He had so many incredible stories, ghost stories, just an incredible kind of orator, storyteller. And I think of other friends from different diasporic backgrounds, from the Caribbean, from the continent, from different parts of the African continent, different languages, different mythologies. And it just feels like we're losing out on all these glorious stories.
But when did you realize that the game was changing for black horror, black cinema, if you like?
I mean, this is where, I think this is where it gets really interesting, because again, can't emphasize it more, which is you know, horror noir, I think, is such an excellent documentary, because it's able to kind of compile all of that information and knowledge into one go-to space, and just to be able to get the directors and actors and academics into one place, just such a historical feat. So yeah, that's a must watch. I don't know. I mean, the easy answer would be to sort of say, oh, Jordan Peele, da, 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 da. And there's some truth to that. But then I would say, if you're looking at African American culture, horror has always been there and not gone away, and an interest in black horror has always been there and not gone away. And I certainly remember stumbling across certain things in magazines in the mid 90s, and of course, you know, Rusty, the Tales from the Hood, and you just mentioned Ernest Dickinson's Tales from the Crypt, offering Demon Knight. It also has a black final girl, Jada Pinkett. I think it's just been a perpetual movement. until this historical moment. And I think, Jordan Peele is sort of leading the way, so to speak. And I think there was an announcement before we came on for a new Jordan Peele film. It's crazy, right? We'd set up to talk about this, and it's like a few minutes before we came online. But I also think it's unfair to just sort of say it's just sort of Jordan Peele and Get Out is this moment. Is this moment? It's one of the moments. But looking at America, there is a huge wealth of Black horror creatives, and particularly Black women at the forefront of that movement. I can't at the moment. I'm just even on social media platforms, Twitter, and I've never seen such incredible journalism and film criticism and critical writing around horror cinema, and all led from the front, speaking from the chest, by African American women, by Black women, and it's just inspirational, and it's certainly inspirational for me. I mean, it's also one of the reasons. That's another one of the reasons why I wanted to kickstart this, because knowing that there's such a healthy culture and engagement with horror in the States, it's like, why is no one doing this really here? So that was another reason, which is, I know that there are loads of Black horror fans in the UK, but where's the place to be able to kind of get together and talk about these things? And I know there are lots of like white friends, Asian friends from Middle Eastern backgrounds, basically people of color that are interested in horror, that already have an interest in horror, or are interested about understanding why people are interested, why people of color are interested in horror. And it's like, how is there's been no space for that? So that's a real push, and generationally, because I can think of like older friends that are into horror, all the way down to kind of like 18, 19, teenagers who are getting into horror cinema and want to explore those themes and notions,
So talk me through what you've got lined, without giving too much away, because we all want to come down and experience it ourselves. What have you got lined up for your first event?
Okay, so for the first event, it's a screening of The Beast Must Die. So really, it's an intro to the film, and the film. In different circumstances, we probably would have had a number of different sort of interactive things going on. Probably a DJ set. All of that stuff would have happened, but unfortunately, it's the screening of the film at 20th Century Flicks, which is, I think, in and of itself quite a immersive experience, to say the least. So it's in their kind of like mini Kino cinema space, which is it's really kind of like intimate, cool sort of vibe. It's still capped audiences, sadly. However, this is just the beginning. It was just a way for us to get onto the map, kickstart things. I can't say too much, but we're gonna do something around, obviously, the Nia DaCosta's Candyman. Fingers crossed.
Okay.
Don't give too much away. And there is a horror season coming up, but I don't want to talk. I can't say too much just yet. All of that stuff. If you check out our Twitter, I don't know whether you're able to kind of put.
I will put that along the top, certainly.
And the website is coming next month, so early August. And event stuff will be up there online. But there is a horror season coming up where we will delve into possibly some of the titles we've discussed thus far.
Sounds good.
And a podcast. That's on the way soon as well. So, oh god, there's other stuff I want to say, but we can't say until everything's kind of.
You're being such a tease, Adam. You really are. Anybody watching this should and loves horror and Black horror especially should be getting excited. Which brings me to my next question: are there tickets available?
We've sold out.
Aha!
Which is a delight. I mean, I really can't believe it. But we've we've managed to kind of sell out on our first screening, which is just a curator's dream come true, you know.
Yeah,
So
I can imagine.
I'm so excited to kind of take it to the next stage. I mean, this is just the launch event, but I mean, the hope is things are going to start building. I mean, we're also looking at kind of merchandise, all kinds of different things, but most of this stuff is to kind of help to fund more events, and then also kind of hopefully kickstart some kind of creative projects, you know. So yeah, I mean, it's like it's early doors, but all of this is very much around wanting to kind of create a community, an audience that's interested in horror and is interested in diasporic tales, you know.